What's up, tribe? How you guys doing? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button, and I hope you like this video. This is Secrets of Playboy, you guys, season 1, episode 8. I believe we're on. I feel like we're gonna get a whole 10 episodes, because there's another episode next week, and it sounds like next week's episode sound like we coming in on the conclusion. We kind of bringing it on in. So I feel like we're gonna get 10 episodes. But anyway. So this episode is about the Shadow Mansions. Y'all, just when we thought we had heard it all, just when we thought we got a grasp on this, I even said last week, I think they probably did too many episodes because it sounds like we're sort of repeating ourselves. Just when I thought, I realized we got a whole nother layer to this thing. And some stuff that we learned in the first episode is coming back around to this episode as well. So the Shadow Mansions are just what they sound like. These are basically, I'll go through my notes, but basically in I wrote the year down. I didn't write the year down. In the 1990s, I do not have the exact year. I thought I wrote it down. But in the 1990s, Hugh Hefner actually got married. He married a woman by the name of Kimberly Conrad. She was a centerfold. You know, she was a Playboy woman. And they said that when she got married, when her and Hef got married, she sort of shut stuff down. Like the party sort of stopped at the mansion. You know, playmates weren't allowed to talk to Hugh Hefner. Like that was a surefire way to get you blacklisted. And so when that happened, the party didn't stop. It just moved. And so these Shadow Mansions are friends of Hugh Hefner, people who were in his inner circle, who basically mimicked what was going on at the Playboy Mansion, at their own mansions. Also, the women that were at these Shadow Mansions were generally women who didn't make the cut and couldn't go to the Playboy Mansion, get invited to the Playboy Mansion, whatever. So that's the big idea. Now let's break it down. Let's go through these notes, child. Mike Saganor, who we've heard about him a few times throughout this process. He was Hugh Hefner's personal doctor, personal physician, and his best friend. Now, if you go back to the first episode, we met his daughter, Jennifer Sagnor. I believe I'm saying that right. She actually wrote a book. She said that her father was best friends with Hugh Hefner, and she actually ended up living in the Playboy Mansion. And if you remember her story, she wrote a book, and she talked about, you know, how she talked about the sex parties and knowing what was going on, and how her father was, you know, in the mix. And she talked about she having her first sexual experience with a woman, one of Hugh Hefner's women, and how he actually approached her for a threesome, right? And remember in that first episode, we were like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, how could you do that? Your best friend's daughter? Like, she talked about how, you know, she started hanging out at the Playboy Mansion when she was like 3 years old. So this is a girl you watched literally grow up. And I don't think she was even over 18 when this proposition happened. I'm almost certain she was like 16, but don't quote me on that. But I would have to go back to my first review. But anyway, so that's her dad. Now what we find out is that in the 1990s, wait a minute, I have the exact, now that year I did write down, hold on. In the 1990s, he was actually indicted. Now, those charges didn't stick. There were a lot of accusations against him for sexual misconduct. A lot of women went to the authorities, but for whatever reason, the charges didn't stick. I suspect, this wasn't what was said, I suspect that Hugh Hefner had a lot to do with it. The fact that we know that, you know, the culture of women making accusations is always that hard road to prove. If there's no corroboration, it's my word against yours that these things happen. Even when you have multiple accusers, if there's no hard evidence, if there's no rape kit, if there's none of those things, it's really, really hard to prove that these things happen. And also, let's not forget that Hugh Hefner had a lot of information on the LAPD, and they may not have been too enthusiastic about really pressing the issue. Now, publicly, Hugh Hefner sort of separated himself and distanced himself from Dr. Sagnol. I'm going to just call him Mark because I don't want to keep messing up his last name. But privately, they stayed friends. Now, what we also remember, if you guys forgot, you remember Sandra. Sandra was Hugh Hefner's ex-girlfriend, late 70s, early 80s, I think from like 76 to 81. They were together for 5 years, and she's the one that talked about, you know, the sexcapades and the orgies and just how she just, by the time she left, she was just a shell of herself and, you know, was addicted to drugs. And she talked about the fact that she was a mule for him and ran his, you know, brought his drugs into the house and things like that. In her, I think her episode was probably episode 3 or 4. In her episode, she talked about Mark, and she talked about the fact that Mark and Hugh Hefner had a sexual relationship. Well, that comes up again in this episode where his daughter says the same thing. She said, you know, when Hugh Hefner separated himself from my dad, it hurt him. She said, and at the time, I didn't really understand that the level of hurt. Why he was, you know, why he was so hurt, you know, that why I was on that level. She said, but you know, the more I've sort of put things together, and of course she's privy to more information than what she's necessarily sharing with us. She said, I realized that they were more than just best friends, and I do suspect that the relationship was sexual. So there are a couple of people that are saying that the relationship was sexual. Now, at the end of this episode, I want to say this because I don't want to forget. What I find to be very interesting is that at the end of this episode, they did get a quote from him, which he's still alive, and they got a quote from him, and he said, I don't deny any of the sexual, like, misconduct allegations. So he's basically saying, I did it. I'm guilty. He said, but I do deny the other accusations, and the only other accusations was his relationship with Hugh Hefner. So they did show an old video clip of Hugh Hefner being interviewed where he does admit to having homosexual thoughts. Now, he doesn't admit to acting on them, but he does speak on the 70s and the orgies and, you know, people exploring their bisexuality, and that he, you know, it was a thought, but he doesn't admit to actually indulging. Okay? So I wanted to say all that because I don't want to forget none of that. All right. Now, Hugh Hefner actually started a club that was outside of the Playboy mansion called Pips. Now, Pips was a club on the front side, but it was also a game room, which backgammon clubs seem to have been a big deal during the 70s, 80s, I guess, because I was looking at the Secrets of the Chippendales, and there was another situation with a backgammon club. Who knew? I didn't know. I remember my brother having a backgammon set when he was a kid. I remember that being like when he got it for Christmas, and I remember when he got it, oh my gosh, like he was so excited to have his backgammon set. Oh my gosh. So I guess it was a thing. I don't know. But so the VIP area was where they would play the games, right? The VIP, they would play backgammon and Monopoly and, you know, all these different like board games and stuff. And they talked about how they would be betting on the women. Unbeknownst to them, the women would be up, you know, if I lose this game, then her are going to go home with me. That kind of thing. And the women I'm going to say some might have been in on it, but most of them were like, had no idea that this is what was going on. And Jennifer, who is Mark's daughter, the one who wrote the book, she talked about how she was at the club and this was her place to hang out and how important she felt, you know, it was her job to greet the ladies and take them in that back area in the VIP, and she talked about that, and she was the one that talked about the fact that a lot of times the women were part of the bets. Okay. Charmaine Silver, who was a former bunny, she actually became a partner in a modeling agency with a man by the name of Bernie Cornfield. Now, he was the first shadow mansion in this shadow mansion system. He had a fake modeling agency, which was really just a front for a way for him to recruit women. He even had a dormitory set up, just like remember the Playboy Mansion in Chicago, where the one of the upper floors was a dormitory for the bunnies to stay there, and they lived in the mansion. Same thing, we know that women actually lived in the Playboy Mansion in LA. So he had a dormitory, and Charmaine said that she realized that he basically was just using this as a front to basically be able to have access to these women, because she found out that at night he would be sneaking up to the dormitory and basically having his pick of the litter. And I'm not calling women dogs, I'm just using that as a term, so please don't come for me. Okay. They talked about how visibility for the Playboy bunnies in the 90s changed. In the 1980s, 1970s, we've already talked about the fact that they were just sort of, it was just like a sort of a system. You come in, you pose, and all these different things. But a combination of things happened in the 90s. One, things sort of slowed down at the Playboy Mansion for two reasons. One, because of HIV and AIDS, and two, because Hugh Hefner got married. Now, I already told you when he got married, his wife was like, this is what we're not doing down here, okay? Or they were probably a lot more selective about what they did, because I don't think for a minute that Hugh Hefner stopped doing all the things he was doing, but they were probably a lot more selective about it. But they said because of that, because there was less frolicking going on at the Playboy Mansion, and the sexcapades have been sort of dimmed a little bit because of HIV, we started seeing a lot of the Playboy bunnies in the 90s being able to live up to that dream that was given to the bunnies of the 70s and the 80s, that this can be your stepping stone into the next era. This could be the way you get into mainstream. And you remember Nikki, who used to be the head of Playboy Playmate Promotions, she talked about this is what she wanted for the bunnies. She wanted this to be an opportunity for them to springboard into acting and mainstream modeling and stuff like that. Well, in the 1990s, we actually saw that happen. And we saw people like the Anna Nicoles, the Jenny McCarthy's, the Pam Andersons. And those were some of the other names I was trying to remember in the last review. And these women, we all know these names. These are all household names. I mean, Jenny McCarthy is still a judge on The Masked Singer to this day. She's been on The View. She has a podcast. We know, Pam Anderson is a legend. She did Baywatch and so many other things, including the sex tape. Anna Nicole Smith, who unfortunately met an early demise, but we know all about her story and her having that mainstream guest contract. And so Yasmin Bleak, I think, is another one. Carmen Electra. Like, a lot of these women of the 90s were able to do that. Take Playboy and springboard it. Now, again, I'm not saying that there wasn't no sex going on and all that other stuff stopped 100%. But a lot of it did move into these shadow mansion system. And some women, I think, maybe didn't get caught up in a lot of that because of the new cautiousness of sexuality in the 90s, right? So, the shadow mansions were basically, they would these scouts, these recruits would go out to the clubs, and they would recruit these women, and they had a system. If you were a 10, a 9 or a 10, you were invited to the Playboy Mansion. If you were, an 8 or a 7, then, you would go to the Shadow Mansion. And Shadow Mansion was, it is, like I said, it's just what it sounds like. It's the women who didn't, and I hate to say it like that, but the women who didn't fit the Playboy idea of what Hugh Hefner thought he could sell, right? That doesn't mean these women were unattractive. That doesn't mean these women were undesirable, but they weren't what Hugh Hefner thought he could take and create something with. We hear the story of Rachel Myers. She was invited to the Playboy Mansion. She was told that in order to get to the Playboy Mansion, she had to show her boobs. And so she said, I thought this was what it was. Playboy is a magazine where women are topless. She said, I didn't think nothing of it. She said there were other pictures of women on the table that, had their boobs out. So she took the pictures. She got invited to the Playboy Mansion. She said she even got invited to Hugh Hefner's table. And then from there on, she was invited to the Shadow Mansion. Now, they ain't say this, but I read between the lines, and what I heard was you met Hugh Hefner, and he ain't think that you was good enough to stay at the Playboy Mansion. And again, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with this woman, but based on how they explain this Shadow Mansion system, if you actually met Hugh Hefner, but you were then sent to the Shadow Mansion, that tells me that something in that meeting with Hugh Hefner, he wasn't impressed with. Again, I'm not trying to be mean about it, but I just gotta call it like I see it. A lot of these men had these, they would have these fake photo shoots. Again, these women thinking that they're doing these photo shoots for Playboy or for these modeling agencies. And of course, we know the story. They would be drugged and then they would be assaulted. Pete Niger is another name that came up. A woman talked about how, he anally raped her, and there go that anal thing again. That has come up a few times as well. Anyway, in 2021, he was indicted though. So he was indicted. Jennifer told the story of a woman by the name of Paulina, because she said her father ended up having a Shadow Mansion as well. When he got indicted in the 90s, he sort of became the fall guy for the whole Shadow Mansion system, even though he wasn't the only one that was doing it, but he sort of became like the marquee name attached to the whole Shadow system. But she talked about a girl by the name of Paulina who was from Europe, came over to be a model, got addicted to cocaine, because again they stressed how these women came in one way and left another. These women came in, from Smallville, USA, with dreams of posing in Playboy, and left a few years later strung out and whatever else we know. God knows what else. And she said one night, Paulina was looking for drugs, and she was basically desperate. She hooked up with some guy. They went into the bathroom, and she said Paulina never came out. She was in there for a very long time. She said she finally knocked on the door, opened the door. Paulina was laid on the floor. She said it was blood everywhere. She said she called for help. Nobody came. Eventually, security came and carried her out. And she said that she used the term lifeless body. She said she never saw Paulina again. And a few weeks later, she said a man came to the door, knocked on the door with a picture of Paulina and said, "This is my daughter. Have you seen her?" And she talked about how bad she felt. She talked about how bad she felt that she lied to that man. She said, "I had been indoctrinated, from the very beginning. Like, no, I haven't seen her. You must have the wrong house." And she said, I think about that. Like, those are the kinds of things that haunt me. Now, the only thing I could think of is that she done already made this situation right with the police and with Paulina's family for her to be so freely telling this story. Or maybe Paulina ain't her real name and they just changed the name for the purposes of the story. I don't know. Then she said, for this whole time, I always thought that I was immune to this. Like, yeah, this happened to all these other women, but I was in the boys club, because of my dad. I had a past. And she said, but it wasn't until one of my dad's friends who was part of the circle, how he assaulted me as well. She went on to talk about how her dad and Hugh Hefner never stopped talking, like, behind the scenes. And eventually, towards the end of Hugh Hefner's life, they started hanging out publicly again, and that he was by his side when he passed away. She said a few years later, her father got married. She said, and her father's wedding was basically a memorial to Hugh Hefner. They played his favorite song at the wedding, and she said her father broke down in tears. There were pictures of Hugh Hefner and different people, like, throughout the, like, reception, like, blown up pictures on easels throughout the reception. She said, and there was a lot of people there from the old, Playboy, that had their Playboy pins on. She said, and I realized this isn't a wedding ceremony. This is a celebration of Hugh Hefner, which again plays up to the idea that she thought it was more to it, more going on between Hugh Hefner and her dad. But yeah, y'all, that was this week's episode. So Next week, like I said, it looks like we're sort of winding it down next week. So I'm thinking we're going to get 10 episodes. Anyway, y'all let me know what y'all think. I'll talk to y'all later. Peace.